God's ways are different than the world. And while I know that we know this, sometimes we may miss out on how obvious this fact is because of the culture that we are in. And we're often confused because we are confused that the American way and the way of Christ are the same, is what we think. We've been accustomed to thinking that as Americans, most of our ways line up fairly well with the Bible, as most of the world considers America a Christian nation. While the last several decades of pluralism and multiculturalism have begun to change that overall dynamic, the myth has for a large part been ingrained. Of course, as students of the Bible, as faithful church members and followers of Christ, we know that this is not true. We know that the American way and the way of the cross are very different things. They do not have to be at odds, but they are certainly not the same. And much of the things that Jesus railed against with the Pharisees, he would still rail against in our modern American culture. Many of the things that were difficult for those in the Bible, for them to hear, are difficult for us to hear, because people are the same. Even though times have changed and we may do things differently, our core nature is the same. We still have the same desires, the same needs, the same issues. And that's why we can look to the Bible and learn valuable insights about our own lives, because the people they are speaking about and to are people just like us. As we've been working during this season of Lent to cultivate personal holiness, we have seen how different the lessons from the Bible can be from our own modern culture and daily lives. From the first lesson on submission, a word we don't dare say in public, right? To the need for confession, an admission of the things we've done wrong, even including fasting from food when we have so many options. And would you like a supersize order with that? And the Christian practice of meditation, the focusing and intentional filling ourselves with God. All of these things that most people would say are common, would not say are common to today's society, right? Yet we seek to be like Jesus, to be his disciples, to live like he lived. If we do that, we desire to do that, these things that we've already talked about must be included. Last week, we introduced the topic of Christian meditation, of focusing our mind on Christ, on God, on Scripture, on God's works. It may be a new concept for many, yet it has always been a part of biblical record, a behavior of the faithful. As we seek to build on this foundation, there are two other disciplines or practices that often go along with meditation and aid in connecting with God: solitude and silence. Of course, our children's message today was not about the solitude part. We just talked about the silence part, but we're going to address both solitude and silence. I fear that many people view these practices as reserved for the most holy, for those who are called to be monks or nuns, for those who are called to be in ordained ministry, or to something unique in ministry. Yet these practices are for all who wish to connect with God, for all desire to develop a deeper relationship with God, to hear God, and to rest in God's presence. That is mostly what solitude is about resting in God's presence. Just as fasting was described as giving up food so that God could be our sustenance, so solitude is taking intentional time away from the noise, away from the world, away from all the other things that fill us up in our lives, so that we can leave room and make room for God. It is an interesting phenomenon to say that we want more of God, but then to never give God space to fill because we are full of everything else. Solitude is a chance to carve out space in our lives for God, to fill us with what we need to hear God's wisdom, to listen to God's voice, or just to be alone with God. It may sound like a strange concept, but consider it this way. If you are in love with someone, you may want to spend time with them. I don't think may should be in there. You want to spend time with them. You would carve out time from your busy schedule, maybe even schedule regular time with them, time to talk, time to listen, time to get away, maybe to a quiet place no one else will bother you, to turn off your cell phones, put down your tablets, just be together. That's what solitude is with God. And it's something we all need to have. People have always needed it. Consider Paul from the passage in Galatians. He was recalling how after his conversion experience, he went to a solitary place so that he could hear from God, talk to God, get understanding and clarity before he ever started on his ministry. Or consider Jesus, who would go continually into solitude, sometimes sending the disciples off ahead, sometimes just leaving them behind. Even at the Garden of Gethsemane, when he knew what he was about to face, he called the disciples to come pray for him and with him. Then he went off alone to pray. He went to a solitary place. To make the point that this is something for everyone and not just for the special ones, consider what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6:6. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Clearly, Jesus was indicating that each person should spend some time alone with God, maybe even in a special place that is set apart from others, for you to be yourself with God. We call this quiet time, as Pastor Hayden mentioned last week. Meditation can be a part of it, as can confession and submission, but a big part of it is the solitary nature. A big part of this is being alone with God. This time alone with God can allow us to focus on hearing from God and not all the other noises that can often draw our attention, sometimes even demand them. Consider the lesson of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. This was immediately after a tremendous experience that Elijah had where God showed up on Mount Carmel to prove that he was God and to disprove the validity of those who worshiped Baal and Asherah. Unfortunately, the rulers of Israel at the time did not worship God and desired to kill Elijah. Elijah was so distraught, he went out into the wilderness to die. It is amazing that this man who had just seen the power of God on display at Mount Carmel would wither so easily at the threat from King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Nevertheless, here he was desiring to die. But instead, he got a visit from an angel who let him know that there was more to do. We pick up the story from 1 Kings 19, verse 7. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. The angel had prepared food for him, and then he would spend the next 40 days fasting on the same mountain where Moses met God and received the 10 Commandments. Obviously, this mountain was considered holy, as this was where the burning bush first appeared, and the law was given. So Elijah needed to spend time with God, and he wound up here. Verse 9 continues, "At the place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' He answered, 'I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away.'" Of course, it is notable that the word of the Lord came to him asking what he was doing, but notice the honesty from Elijah. He lays himself bare. He declares his heart, his lament for how the people have acted, his fear for his life, and his feelings of loneliness. He is not holding anything back because he is spending time with God in secret. But what happens next really sets the stage for the second part of this discipline, the second part of this practice. Here's what happens in verse 11 through 12. He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. First, there was wind, a great and powerful noise, breaking rocks, splitting mountains. Talk about something that would get your attention. It demands it. We have to take notice. We can't ignore it. And in certain circumstances, all that is true, but Elijah wasn't in any danger. He was trying to find God, and God was not in the wind. God was not in the noise. Next, there was an earthquake, a similar force, except it literally shakes the ground on which you stand. Again, demanding your attention, demanding you notice. But God was not in the earthquake. But that was not all that could distract. There was also fire, overwhelming heat, I am sure, a spectacle that always draws the eyes as we watch the flames dance. Yet God was not there either. All these things that we hear, feel, see, and yet God was not in any of them. And then sheer silence. No more rustling of the leaves, no more deafening sound of the rocks falling, no more snaps and crackling of embers burning, just silence. All the noise gone. God is here. Verse 13, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the mantle and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So often we want to hear God, yet it is so hard to listen for all of the noise, all of the distractions. Elijah, when he hears the silence, knows God is there, and God comes out to start a conversation. Isn't that awesome? That's so amazing, powerful. Silence is so foreign in our culture. We hear sound all of the time. Music, cars, sirens, noise upon noise. And I can't help but think about the story of the Grinch. The Grinch says, and then all the noise, they'll bang on their tongue tinglers, blow their flute flounders. They'll crash on their jang jinglers and bounce on the boing bounders. I honestly don't know about jang jinglers, although anybody who has had kids, that's all the toys, the sounds that they make. But do you know anybody that walks in the house and turns the TV on first thing so that there's noise? Even in the whirring of our computer fans breaks the silence. Silence for so many is scary because the noise has become our comfort zone, whereas the silence forces us to wait on God. In Revelation 8, it reveals that there will be half an hour of total silence in heaven. Total silence. Silence is difficult because we feel the need to fill the space with noise. Silence seems empty to us. But perhaps we should recognize that silence can be filled with God without the use of words or sounds. It takes a lot of comfort, a lot of peaceful feelings to sit in silence. And so it is with God. The practice of solitude and silence is an opportunity for us to spend time away with God and just be comfortable in the presence of God. Yet we can be honest and share our deepest thoughts with God. But we may need to leave time for silence to give room for God to speak. So how do we apply this practice? The first step is to schedule your quiet time. I know, one more thing on the calendar, right? But it's probably the most important thing that would be there. Schedule your devotional time with God. This is a relationship that you have to put time into, not just expect God to do all the work. Second, find a nice place to get away from the noise. It may be a place in your house, or in a park, or on the field of grace, or at the hilltop with the crosses, or maybe even the new meditation garden that is located just down the hill. Find a place, set aside time, spend time in meditation, and then set aside time to be quiet. Just sit there, chasing all the distractions out of your mind so that you can be silent before the Lord. At first, you may want to set a timer for 10 minutes so you don't look at your phone or your watch, but just sit in silence. And practice this regularly. God may not speak to you every time, but it is more about getting comfortable and being alone with God and giving space for God to speak. Silence does not mean nothing is happening. Silence is the space for that still small voice. I had a professor once say that healing happens in the space in between. That space, as we cultivate personal holiness, is in the solitude and silent space we create for God. So we can meet God there and be healed by God there. As we continue this practice of solitude and silence, we will feel our lives becoming more ordered in the way of Christ. Just as Jesus was in constant connection with God, so can we be as we cultivate personal holiness in our quest to be disciples of Jesus Christ. Amen.